The first thing Captain Sarah Chen noticed when she woke up wasn't the screaming alarms or the smell of burning metal. It was the silence where her children's breathing should have been. Her eyes snapped open to find their family quarters filled with thick, choking smoke. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red. The artificial gravity fluctuated, making her stomach lurch as she rolled out of bed. Through the viewport she could see the skeletal, remains of other ships drifting past like metal, corpses against the starfield. The Zephyrian fleet had found them. Sarah stumbled to the adjoining room where her 5 children slept. The twins, Marcus and Maya, were already awake at age 12, their dark eyes wide with terror as they shook their younger siblings. 8-year-old Tommy was crying silently, the way he'd learned to do during their years of hiding. 6-year-old Lisa clutched her stuffed elephant, and baby Elena, barely 2 years old, was mercifully still asleep in Tommy's arms. "Mom, what's happening?" Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Before Sarah could answer, the ship shuddered violently. Through the walls she could hear the distant sounds of laser fire and explosions. The human colony ship Harmony was dying around them, and they had maybe minutes before the Zephyrians boarded. Sarah's mind raced through their options. As a former Earth Defense Corps captain, she knew military protocol. When facing overwhelming odds against an enemy that showed no mercy to human civilians, especially children, there was only one choice: run. She grabbed the emergency pack she'd kept ready for 3 years, ever since they'd joined this refugee convoy. Inside were protein bars, water purification tablets, a small medical kit, and her old service pistol with 2 energy cells. Not much, but it would have to do. "Listen to me carefully," she told her children, kneeling down to their level. "We're going to the escape pods. Maya and Marcus, you carry the emergency supplies. Tommy, you keep holding Elena. Lisa, stay close to me." The corridor outside their quarters was chaos. Families ran in every direction, some toward the escape bays, others toward the ship's defensive positions. The overhead speakers crackled with fragmented orders from the bridge, but Sarah could tell from the captain's tone that the battle was already lost. They moved quickly through the maze of corridors, Sarah's military training guiding them through the fastest route to the emergency bays. Behind them she could hear the distinctive whine of Zephyrian boarding pods cutting through the hull. The lizard-like aliens were known throughout human space for their ruthless efficiency and their particular hatred of human children, whom they saw as future threats to be eliminated. As they reached the escape pod bay, Sarah's heart sank. Most of the pods were already gone, and the few remaining ones had long lines of desperate families. In the distance, she could hear the metallic scraping of Zephyrian boots on deck plating. "Getting closer. This way," she whispered, leading her children away from the crowded main bay toward the service pods used by maintenance crews. These smaller pods were harder to detect and could carry 6 people if they squeezed together. The service bay was empty except for 1 pod. Sarah's hands flew over the control panel, her fingers remembering the launch sequences from her military days. The pod powered up just as the first screams echoed from the main bay. "Get in now," she ordered. The children piled into the cramped pod, Elena finally waking up and beginning to cry. Sarah strapped them in as quickly as possible, her hands shaking despite her training. Through the small viewport, she could see Zephyrian soldiers moving through the ship's corridors like deadly shadows. The pod launched just as the first alien warrior rounded the corner toward their bay. Sarah caught a glimpse of yellow reptilian eyes and gleaming teeth before they were free, spinning away from the dying colony ship into the cold vacuum of space. Behind them, the Harmony exploded in a brilliant flash of white light. Sarah closed her eyes and held her children close as debris rattled against their small pod. When she opened them again, the ship that had been their home for 2 years was nothing but expanding gas and twisted metal. "Where are we going, Mom?" Maya asked quietly. Sarah looked at the star charts on the pod's small computer. They were in the Kepler sector, far from any human worlds. The nearest inhabited system was Titan's Gate, but it was controlled by the Zephyrian Empire. Going there would be suicide. She scrolled through the charts looking for any sign of hope. There at the edge of the sector was a small notation, an uncharted system with 3 planets marked only as unexplored in the database. It was their only choice. Somewhere safe, she told her daughter, though she wasn't sure such a place existed anymore. The pod's life support systems hummed quietly as they drifted toward their uncertain destination. Sarah calculated their supplies. They had food and water for maybe a week, air for 10 days if they were careful. The uncharted system was 6 days away at maximum speed. As the stars wheeled slowly around them, Elena's crying gradually stopped, and the other children fell into an exhausted sleep. Sarah remained awake, watching the scanner for any sign of pursuit. She thought about her husband David, who had died defending their previous home on New Geneva. She thought about the thousands of other human refugees scattered across the galaxy, running from an enemy that seemed determined to wipe them out completely. But mostly, she thought about her children and the promise she'd made to David before he died. She would keep them safe no matter what. She would find them a place where they could grow up without fear, where they could be children instead of refugees. The pod continued its journey through the darkness, carrying its precious cargo toward an unknown world and an uncertain future. Behind them, the wreckage of the Harmony grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, leaving them alone among the stars. Sarah adjusted the pod's course toward the uncharted system and settled in for the long journey ahead. Whatever waited for them in that distant place, it had to be better than what they were leaving behind. It had to be. 6 days later, the escape pod's hull groaned under atmospheric pressure as it descended through thick clouds toward an unknown world. Sarah gripped the controls, fighting to keep their descent stable while her children pressed their faces to the small viewports. "I can see trees," Tommy exclaimed, his fear temporarily forgotten in the excitement of seeing something green after so many years in space. Sarah's instruments showed a breathable atmosphere and normal gravity, but that was all they could tell her. The planet appeared uninhabited, at least by anything that used technology. No cities, no energy signatures, no communication signals. Just endless forests, rivers, and mountains stretching to the horizon. The pod touched down in a clearing beside a wide river, its landing thrusters scorching the alien grass. As the engines powered down, Sarah ran through her mental checklist. Their supplies were almost gone. Elena needed fresh diapers and proper food. They all needed shelter before nightfall. She activated the pod's external sensors and waited. No immediate threats detected. The air outside registered as safe to breathe, though it carried an unfamiliar sweetness that made her nervous. On Earth, sweet smells in nature often meant danger. "Stay here while I check outside," she told the children, though Marcus was already reaching for the door controls. "I'm coming with you," he said. At 12, he was trying to be the man of the family, and Sarah could see David's determination in his eyes. She considered arguing but decided she might need the help. "Fine, but you do exactly what I say." The pod's door hissed open and Sarah stepped onto the surface of an alien world for the first time in her life. The gravity felt normal, maybe slightly lighter than Earth standard. The air was warm and humid, filled with the sounds of creatures she couldn't identify. Insects buzzed overhead and somewhere in the distance something large crashed through the underbrush. Marcus followed her out, his eyes wide as he took in their surroundings. The grass beneath their feet was purple-tinted, and the trees towered overhead like nothing from Earth, their trunks smooth and silver, their leaves a brilliant blue-green. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Sarah was more focused on survival. She could see fruit hanging from some of the nearby trees, but she didn't know if it was safe to eat. The river looked clean, but alien water could contain pathogens that human systems couldn't handle. They needed to find shelter and figure out what was edible before their remaining supplies ran out. A scream from inside the pod made both of them spin around. Through the viewport, Sarah could see Maya backing away from something, Elena crying in her arms. Something was moving in the pod's doorway. Sarah drew her pistol and ran toward the pod, Marcus close behind her. As she got closer, she could see what had frightened Maya. A small, furry creature about the size of a house cat was sitting in the doorway, its large eyes focused on the children. It looked harmless enough, but Sarah had learned not to trust appearances. "Get back," she ordered the creature, raising her weapon. The animal tilted its head and made a soft chirping sound. Then, to Sarah's amazement, it backed away from the pod and sat down in the grass as if it understood her command. "Did it just—" Marcus started to say. "Understand me," Sarah finished. "Yeah, I think it did." She kept her pistol ready as she approached the creature. It had 6 legs and silvery fur that seemed to shimmer in the alien sunlight. Its eyes were large and intelligent, and when it looked at her, she had the strange feeling that it was trying to communicate something. The creature stood up and walked a few steps toward the forest, then stopped and looked back at them. It repeated the motion several times. "I think it wants us to follow it," Maya said from inside the pod. Sarah's military training screamed warnings. Following an unknown alien creature into an unknown forest was the kind of mistake that got people killed. But they needed food and shelter, and their current location was too exposed. If the Zephyrians had somehow tracked them, they'd be sitting ducks in the open clearing. Everyone out, she decided. We're going to follow our new friend, but stay close together. The children climbed out of the pod, Tommy still carrying Elena while Lisa clutched her stuffed elephant. Sarah grabbed their remaining supplies and sealed the pod. They might need to come back for it later. The creature led them along a path that wasn't quite a path, more like a corridor through the trees, where the undergrowth had been naturally cleared. As they walked, Sarah noticed more of the six-legged creatures watching them from the branches. They seemed curious but not threatening. After 20 minutes of walking, they emerged into another clearing where Sarah stopped in amazement. Someone or something had built a structure here. It wasn't quite human architecture, but it wasn't completely alien either. The building was made of woven branches and some kind of hardened clay, with multiple levels and rooms that seemed designed for creatures about human size. The little creature that had guided them ran up to the structure and disappeared inside. A moment later, it emerged with 4 others of its kind. They all sat in a line and looked at the humans expectantly. "Are they trying to give us their home?" Lisa asked innocently. Sarah studied the structure more carefully. It was weathered as if it hadn't been used in some time. The creatures had clearly built it, but they didn't seem to be living in it now. Maybe they were offering it as temporary shelter. She approached slowly, her hands visible but ready to grab her weapon if needed. The creatures remained perfectly still as she examined the building. Inside, she found multiple rooms with what looked like sleeping areas, and a central space that might have been for cooking or gathering. Everything was sized for beings about the height of her children. "It's like they built it for us," Marcus said, following her inside. Sarah had the same thought, which made her nervous. How could these creatures have known humans would need shelter here? Unless... She examined the construction more closely and found her answer scratched into one of the clay walls. Human symbols carved deep into the hardened surface, numbers and letters that formed a date from 15 years ago, and beneath it a name. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, Xenological Survey Team 7. "Other humans were here before us," she told the children. "A long time ago." The implications hit her immediately. If Dr. Rodriguez had been here 15 years ago, before the war with the Zephyrians started, then this planet might be on the old survey maps. And if it was on the maps, Sarah pushed the worry aside. They needed shelter now, and this place offered it. They could deal with other problems as they arose. That night, as her children slept safely in the alien structure, Sarah stood guard outside under the light of 2 small moons. The creatures that had helped them were still nearby. She could sense them watching from the forest. But she didn't feel threatened. If anything, she felt protected. Tomorrow she would start teaching her children how to survive on this world. They would learn to identify safe food and clean water, how to avoid the dangerous animals they'd heard calling in the night, and how to be human while living among aliens. For the first time since the harmony was destroyed, Sarah allowed herself to hope that they might actually make it. 3 weeks on the alien world had taught Sarah that survival required more than just military training. It required patience, creativity, and the willingness to trust beings that didn't look anything like humans. The 6-legged creatures, which Elena had started calling kitties despite their obvious intelligence, had become their guides and protectors. Sarah had learned to recognize different types by their markings and behavior. The silver-furred ones were the scouts and hunters. The brown ones with distinctive white stripes seemed to be the builders and engineers. The rare golden ones appeared to be leaders, though their social structure was unlike anything in human xenological texts. This morning, one of the golden kitties approached their shelter with unusual urgency. It chittered and gestured toward the sky, then ran a few steps toward the forest before returning. Sarah had learned to read their body language over the past weeks, and this one was clearly agitated about something. "Mom, what's wrong with Sunny?" Maya asked, using the name she'd given to the golden kitty that visited most often. Before Sarah could answer, her question was answered by a distant rumble in the sky. She looked up to see a dark speck growing larger against the blue-green clouds. A ship was approaching, and from its angular design and the way it moved, Sarah knew it wasn't human. "Everyone inside now," she ordered, her voice calm despite the ice in her veins. Pack everything we can carry. We might have to run." The children moved with the efficiency they'd learned during their years as refugees. Marcus and Maya gathered their few possessions while Tommy helped Elena into the carrying sling Sarah had fashioned from pod materials. Lisa clutched her stuffed elephant and the small collection of pretty stones she'd found by the river. Sarah checked her pistol and counted their remaining energy cells. 2 shots left, maybe 3 if she was lucky. Against a Zephyrian boarding party, it might as well be a sharp stick. The kitties around their shelter had begun making low, urgent sounds. Sunny ran back and forth between Sarah and the forest, clearly trying to tell her something. Finally, the creature grabbed the edge of Sarah's pants in its teeth and pulled her toward the trees. "I think they want us to hide," Marcus said. Sarah looked at the approaching ship, now close enough that she could make out its predatory lines. It was definitely Zephyrian, probably a scout vessel. They had maybe 5 minutes before it landed. She made her decision. "We follow Sunny. Stay close and quiet." The golden kitty led them into the forest at a pace that was almost too fast for the children. Sarah carried Elena while Tommy held onto Lisa's hand to keep her from falling behind. Behind them she could hear the whine of alien engines as the ship settled into the clearing they'd just abandoned. Sunny led them through a maze of trails that seemed to exist only in the kitty's mind. They climbed over fallen logs, splashed through shallow streams, and ducked under low-hanging branches that seemed to close behind them like curtains. After 30 minutes of hard travel, they reached what looked like a dead end against a wall of solid rock. The golden kitty disappeared into what Sarah had taken for shadows, but was actually a narrow cave entrance hidden behind hanging vines. She hesitated for a moment, then heard the distant sound of Zephyrian voices calling to each other in their harsh, clicking language. They were searching. Sarah pushed through the vines into a cave that opened up into a vast underground chamber. Bioluminescent fungi provided a soft blue glow, revealing that they weren't alone. Dozens of kitties filled the space, along with other creatures Sarah had only glimpsed in the forest. Large, bear-like animals with intelligent eyes. Flying creatures with rainbow wings that looked too delicate to be real. Even some plant-like beings that moved with deliberate purpose. All of them were watching the humans with expressions Sarah was learning to read as concern and protection. "It's like a hidden city," Maya whispered in wonder. Sarah was more focused on the strategic implications. This wasn't just a cave. It was a shelter specifically designed to hide from aerial detection. The rock formations above would block most scanning equipment, and the multiple tunnel entrances she could see suggested several escape routes. Sunny approached with another golden kitty, this one larger and bearing scars that spoke of old battles. The new arrival studied Sarah with eyes that held an almost human intelligence, then made a series of complex gestures. To Sarah's amazement, images began forming in her mind. Not words, but pictures and emotions that conveyed meaning more clearly than language. She saw the planet as it had been before humans arrived, peaceful and green. Then came images of the first human scientists, working alongside the native species to study the world. Dr. Rodriguez and her team had been welcomed, had shared knowledge and friendship with the kitties. Then came darker images. Ships arriving without warning. Zephyrian soldiers spreading across the planet's surface. The human scientists trying to protect their alien friends. Fighting battles they couldn't win. Dr. Rodriguez's final act had been to hide the location data for this world, ensuring that the Zephyrians would have to search for it rather than simply flying to the coordinates. The scarred kitty's mental images continued. The native species had survived by going underground, by learning to hide from the reptilian hunters. They'd waited 15 years for more humans to arrive, hoping that someday their friends would return. Now Sarah understood why the creatures had helped her family so readily. They weren't just being kind to strangers. They were honoring a promise made to humans long ago, and they'd been waiting all this time to fulfill it. Above them, she could hear the rumble of the Zephyrian ship as it searched the forest. The aliens would find their abandoned shelter, would know that humans had been there. But they wouldn't find the cave, not unless they stayed for weeks and searched every rock formation on the continent. "How long can we stay here?" Sarah asked the scarred kitty, not sure if it would understand her words. The answer came in images again. As long as necessary. The underground city had food, water, and air circulation systems that the native species had developed over millions of years. They could stay hidden indefinitely, but Sarah knew they couldn't hide forever. Eventually, the Zephyrians would bring more ships, more soldiers. They would search every cave and tunnel until they found the hidden city. When that happened, not only would her family be captured, but the entire native population would be enslaved or exterminated. She needed a better plan. That night, as her children slept safely in a chamber the kiddies had prepared for them, Sarah sat with the scarred leader and began working out the details of something that would either save them all or get them all killed. It was time to stop running and start fighting. Dak, the golden kitty, seemed to read her thoughts and showed her one final image. Humans and the native species working together, not just to hide, but to actively resist the Zephyrian occupation. It would be dangerous, probably impossible, but it was better than living in fear. Sarah nodded her agreement, and for the first time since fleeing the burning colony ship, she felt like herself again. Not just a refugee mother trying to protect her children, but a soldier with a mission and allies willing to fight alongside her. Tomorrow, they would begin planning their counterattack. 2 months underground had transformed Sarah's children from frightened refugees into something she'd never expected to see. They were becoming warriors, each in their own way. Marcus had taken to the technical aspects of their resistance movement with a passion that reminded Sarah of his father. Working with the brown-striped kitties, he'd learned to understand their bioengineering techniques and had helped design new camouflage systems for their equipment. At 13, he was already thinking like a soldier, but one who fought with his mind instead of just weapons. Maya had become their communications specialist. The 12-year-old had a natural talent for the telepathic link the kitties used to share complex information. She could now speak with most of the native species and had become the primary translator between human and alien resistance members. Even the younger children had found their roles. Tommy, now 9, had become their scout, small enough to crawl through tunnel systems that adults couldn't navigate. Lisa, at 7, had developed an uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived, probably picking up on subtle changes in the kitty's behavior that others missed. And 2-year-old Elena had become the symbol that kept everyone's spirits up, proof that there was still innocence worth protecting in their dark world. But it was Sarah herself who had changed the most. The scared mother who'd fled the burning colony ship had been replaced by someone harder, more focused. She'd learned to think like the Zephyrians, to anticipate their moves and exploit their weaknesses. Today's mission would test everything they'd learned. The Zephyrian base sat in the ruins of Dr. Rodriguez's research station, a sprawling complex of temporary structures and landing pads carved into what had once been a peaceful scientific outpost. 3 ships were stationed there permanently, with supply runs arriving every 2 weeks. Sarah had counted 47 soldiers, plus the inevitable support staff and automated defenses. Under normal circumstances, attacking such a well-defended position would be suicide. But Sarah wasn't planning a normal attack. She crouched at the edge of the forest with her strike team, watching the base through binoculars salvaged from their escape pod. Beside her, Scar, the golden kitty leader, shared tactical information through their telepathic link. The native species had been studying Zephyrian movements for 2 months, learning their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities. The plan was complex, requiring perfect timing and coordination between species that had never fought together before. Sarah would lead a diversionary attack on the eastern perimeter, drawing the garrison's attention while Maya and Marcus infiltrated the communication center with a team of silver kitties. Tommy and the scout specialist would disable the automated defenses from underground, using tunnel systems the Zephyrians didn't know existed. The bear-like creatures, which the children had named Grumps, would handle the heavy lifting once the defenses were down. Sarah checked her weapon one final time. She'd managed to construct 3 improvised explosive devices using components from their escape pod and chemical compounds the brown kitties had helped her synthesize. Not much against 47 enemies, but it would have to do. The attack began with what looked like an accident. One of the flying rainbow creatures, which Elena had dubbed Pretties, swooped low over the base's main power generator and appeared to get tangled in the external cables. As Zephyrian technicians rushed to free the creature and repair the damage, they didn't notice the small charges being placed by kitties who seemed to be simply curious about the commotion. Sarah's diversionary attack started 5 minutes later, right on schedule. She emerged from the tree line alone, firing her pistol at the eastern guard post and shouting human curses at the top of her lungs. To the Zephyrians, it looked like a desperate, probably insane human had finally snapped and decided to go down fighting. The garrison responded exactly as Sarah had hoped. Most of the soldiers rushed toward the eastern perimeter, eager to capture the human who had been evading them for months. They spread out in a classic search pattern, leaving the base's central areas lightly defended. That's when the real attack began. Marcus and Maya slipped into the communications center through a ventilation shaft that the kiddies had modified to be just large, enough for human children. While silver-furred aliens disabled the guards with their natural toxins, the twins began uploading a virus Marcus had designed to corrupt the Zephyrian database and send false reports to their command structure. Underground, Tommy was leading a team of the smallest kiddies through maintenance tunnels toward the automated defense grid. At 9 years old, he was the only human small enough to reach the control systems, and his young hands were steady as he followed the instructions the brown kiddies had taught him through careful telepathic demonstration. The first explosion came from the power generator, plunging half the base into darkness. The second and third came from the vehicle maintenance bay, destroying 2 of the 3 ships and damaging the third beyond immediate use. By the time the Zephyrian commander realized this wasn't a random attack by a crazy human, it was too late to coordinate an effective response. The grumps emerged from concealment like furry avalanches, each one weighing nearly half a ton and moving with surprising speed. They weren't killers by nature, but they understood that these particular aliens threatened the younglings they'd grown to love. Zephyrian soldiers found themselves facing creatures they'd never encountered, beings who could absorb energy weapon fire and keep coming. Sarah kept up her diversionary fire until she heard the signal, a complex harmony of calls from various native species that meant the primary objectives had been achieved. Then she melted back into the forest, leaving the Zephyrians to deal with what looked like a coordinated attack by the planet's entire ecosystem. By the time the base's reinforcements arrived from other installations, the attackers had vanished completely. The communications center was ruined, half the equipment was destroyed, and the garrison was reduced to hiding in their remaining fortifications while strange creatures prowled the perimeter. More importantly, the virus Marcus had uploaded was already spreading through the Zephyrian command network, carrying false reports that would confuse their strategic planning for weeks to come. That night, in the safety of their underground city, Sarah held her children close and listened to the reports from their allies. The attack had been a complete success, with no casualties on their side and significant damage inflicted on the enemy. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The Zephyrians would respond to this setback with overwhelming force, bringing in more ships and soldiers until they could crush any resistance. Their little victory had bought them time, but it had also made them a priority target. "What happens next, Mom?" Marcus asked, his young face serious in the blue glow of the fungi. Sarah looked around at the diverse collection of beings that had become their family. Kitties of every color, grumps with their gentle eyes and massive strength, pretties with their rainbow wings, and even some of the plant-like creatures that moved like slow, thoughtful dancers, all of them looking to her for leadership, trusting her to find a way to protect not just her own children, but their entire world. "Next, we stop running away from fights," she said quietly. "We start taking them to the enemy." Scar shared an image through their mental link, showing Zephyrian ships burning in orbit, while humans and native species worked together to rebuild their world. It was an ambitious vision, probably impossible, but it was worth fighting for. Sarah smiled and began planning their next operation. They had weapons now, allies, and most importantly, they had something the Zephyrians would never understand. They had hope, and they had each other. The war for their new home was just beginning. The Zephyrian response came faster than Sarah had expected. Within a week of their attack on the research base, orbital scans detected 17 new ships entering the system. Not just scouts and patrol vessels, but heavy cruisers equipped for planetary bombardment. Sarah stood in the main chamber of their underground city, surrounded by representatives from every native species on the planet. The images Scar was sharing through their mental network were grim. The Zephyrians weren't just planning to hunt down the resistance. They were preparing to glass the entire continent. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked aloud, knowing that Maya would translate her words for those who couldn't access the telepathic link directly. The answer came in a flood of calculations and observations from hundreds of different minds. 3 days, maybe 4, before the bombardment began. After that, nothing on the surface would survive, and even their deep shelters might not be enough protection. Marcus looked up from the communications equipment he'd been monitoring. "Mom, I'm picking up transmissions from the orbital fleet. They're demanding that all native populations surrender for processing and that any humans present themselves for immediate execution." Sarah felt her children move closer to her. Elena, now walking steadily at 2.5, grabbed onto her mother's leg and looked up with eyes that were too knowing for such a young face. The little girl had learned to recognize the tension that meant danger was coming. "They're scared," Maya said suddenly. "The Zephyrians, I mean. I can feel it through their radio transmissions. They're not just angry about our attack. They're actually afraid of us." Sarah considered her daughter's words. Maya's telepathic abilities had grown remarkably strong, and she'd developed an unusual sensitivity to emotional undertones in electronic communications. If she sensed fear in the enemy transmissions, it meant their small resistance had accomplished more than just tactical damage. "What are they afraid of?" Sarah asked. Maya closed her eyes and concentrated. Her 12-year-old face creased with effort. "They're calling us the hybrid threat. Something about humans working with native species in ways they've never seen before. Their reports mention unprecedented xenotactical integration and evolutionary leap in resistance capacity." Scar shared an image that made Sarah's blood run cold. Zephyrian archives showing world after world where native species had been conquered and enslaved. In every case, the pattern was the same. The aliens would arrive, overwhelm local defenses with superior technology, and then systematically break down any cooperation between different species until they could be controlled individually. But that wasn't happening here. Instead of fracturing under pressure, the diverse species of this world were growing stronger together, learning from each other and developing new capabilities that the Zephyrians had never encountered. Sarah understood now why the enemy was preparing for orbital bombardment instead of a simple ground assault. They weren't just trying to eliminate a resistance cell. They were trying to prevent the spread of something that could threaten their entire empire. "Then we don't just fight for our lives," Sarah said, addressing the assembled representatives. "We fight to show the galaxy that there's another way, that cooperation is stronger than conquest." The response from the native species was immediate and overwhelming. Through the telepathic network, Sarah felt their determination, their willingness to sacrifice everything to protect not just their world, but the possibility of freedom for others. Over the next 3 days, their underground city became a hive of activity, unlike anything in its history. The Brown Kitties worked with human engineering knowledge to construct shield generators using bioelectric principles that Zephyrian sensors couldn't detect. The Grumps began moving through deep tunnel systems, carrying equipment and supplies to positions throughout the continent. The Pretties established aerial relay networks that could coordinate resistance across thousands of square kilometers. But it was the plant-like beings, which Lisa had named dancers, that provided the most crucial element of their defense. These creatures, which Sarah had initially dismissed as minimally intelligent, revealed themselves to be the planet's true engineers. They had been quietly modifying the world's ecosystem for millions of years, and they could make changes in days that would normally take centuries. Working with information from Marcus about Zephyrian weapon systems, the dancers began altering the atmospheric composition in key areas, not enough to harm the native life, but sufficient to interfere with energy weapon efficiency and orbital targeting systems. Sarah's role became coordination between the various elements of their defense. Her military experience helped her understand how the enemy would approach the bombardment, while her growing connection to the telepathic network let her coordinate responses across multiple species simultaneously. On the morning of the 4th day, the bombardment began. Sarah watched from a concealed observation post as beams of superheated plasma carved burning scars across the landscape. The Zephyrians were being systematic, destroying every structure and clearing every forest in a grid pattern that would eventually cover the entire continent. But something was wrong with their targeting. Beams that should have penetrated deep underground were being deflected or absorbed. Areas that should have been reduced to molten glass were recovering with impossible speed, and their orbital scanners were showing life signs in places that had supposedly been sterilized. The dancers are regrowing everything as fast as it's destroyed, Maya reported, her voice filled with wonder. And the bioelectric fields from the kitties are confusing their targeting computers. Marcus looked up from his monitoring station. Mom, they're changing tactics. The fleet is moving to lower orbit for more precise targeting. Sarah smiled grimly. That was exactly what she'd been hoping for. Signal all units, she ordered. Operation Reaching Hand is now active. What the Zephyrians didn't know was that their months of orbital surveillance had been carefully monitored. The native species had learned to track their ships, to predict their movements, and most importantly, to prepare for the moment when they would come close enough to the planet to be vulnerable. As the enemy fleet descended through the upper atmosphere, it encountered the first surprise. Clouds of organic material that had been dispersed by the pretties, particles that clogged intake vents and interfered with sensor arrays. The ships found themselves flying partially blind through an atmosphere that seemed to be actively working against them. The second surprise came when they reached what they thought was safe bombardment altitude. Massive vines grown and launched by the dancers erupted from hidden positions across the continent. Guided by kitty bioelectricity and strengthened with human metallurgy, these organic cables reached up like grasping fingers to snare the descending ships. 3 Zephyrian vessels were pulled into controlled crashes, their crews stunned but alive. 2 more were damaged severely enough that they had to retreat to higher orbit. The remaining ships found themselves under attack from weapons they couldn't understand or effectively counter. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The real battle would start when the surviving ships called for reinforcements and the Zephyrian Empire decided that this small planet represented an existential threat. As evening fell over their scarred but still living world, Sarah gathered her children and their alien allies to prepare for whatever came next. They had proven that cooperation could defeat conquest. But now they would have to prove it again and again, until the rest of the galaxy had a chance to learn from their example. The war for freedom had begun, and it would be fought not with superior weapons or numbers, but with something the Zephyrians could never truly understand: the power of different species working together as one. The captured Zephyrian ships changed everything. Sarah stood in the largest cargo bay of a downed enemy cruiser, watching her children and their alien allies explore technology that was centuries ahead of anything humans had previously encountered. The ship's crew had been taken prisoner, but they were refusing to cooperate, apparently preferring death to the shame of being captured by inferior species. That attitude was about to become their empire's greatest weakness. "Mom, look at this," Marcus called from the engineering section. At 13, he had developed an intuitive understanding of alien technology that amazed even the brown kitties. Their whole computer system is based on the assumption that only Zephyrians will ever use it. There are no security protocols against multi-species access. Maya was working at the communications array, her telepathic abilities allowing her to interface directly with systems designed for reptilian neural patterns. "I'm getting data downloads from their main fleet. They're calling for massive reinforcements, but it's going to take weeks for them to get here." Sarah felt a familiar chill. If the Zephyrians were calling for massive reinforcements, it meant they were planning to eliminate not just this planet, but probably the entire system. They couldn't risk word of a successful multi-species resistance spreading to other worlds. But those same weeks also represented an opportunity, unlike any in galactic history. Tommy emerged from an access tunnel, covered in alien lubricants but grinning widely. "I found where they keep the navigation data." Lisa was right about feeling weird energy from the back section. 7-year-old Lisa nodded seriously. Her ability to sense danger had evolved into something approaching precognitive awareness, especially when it came to technology. The dancers had taken a special interest in her abilities, sharing images that suggested her talent was similar to their own long-term environmental sensing. Even little Elena was contributing in her own way. At 2.5, she had no fear of the alien prisoners and had been chattering at them in her mix of human and kitty languages. To everyone's surprise, some of the younger Zephyrian soldiers had actually begun responding to her, their hostile expressions softening when faced with a human child who treated them like potential friends rather than enemies. Sarah studied the tactical data Maya had extracted from the ship's computers. The Zephyrian Empire controlled over 1,000 worlds, with slave populations from hundreds of different species. but their control was based on keeping those species isolated from each other, preventing exactly the kind of cooperation that had developed on this planet. "What if we could show other worlds what we've accomplished here?" she asked Scar, who was examining Zephyrian weapons with the focused intensity of a tactician. The Golden Kitty shared an image through their mental link, ships leaving this world, carrying mixed crews of humans and native species to other planets, the formation of alliances that spanned star systems, the gradual weakening of Zephyrian control as enslaved populations learned to work together. It was an ambitious vision, but Sarah was beginning to think it might be possible. The captured ships gave them transportation. The native species' unique abilities gave them advantages the Zephyrians couldn't counter. And the enemy's own arrogance gave them opportunities for infiltration and sabotage. "We're going to need more ships," she said finally. Over the following weeks, their underground city was transformed into something between a military academy and a xenological research center. Human refugees who had been hiding throughout the galaxy began arriving, drawn by carefully coded transmissions that Marcus had inserted into Zephyrian communication networks. Most came expecting to find a safe hiding place, but instead found themselves recruited into something far more ambitious. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been a xenobiologist on New Geneva before the Zephyrians destroyed her world. She arrived with 3 other human families and immediately began studying the symbiotic relationships that had developed between species. Her research showed that the cooperation they'd achieved wasn't just tactically effective. It was actually causing evolutionary changes in all participants, including the humans. Captain James Morrison brought military experience from the Earth Defense Corps and a small ship full of refugees from the Centauri colonies. He'd initially been skeptical of Sarah's plans until he saw Tommy leading a mixed squad of humans and kitties through a complex infiltration exercise. The 9-year-old was demonstrating tactical coordination that would have impressed veteran soldiers. Most importantly, word of their success was spreading beyond the human refugee community. Representatives from other enslaved species began making contact, smuggled aboard Zephyrian supply ships or hidden in refugee transports. A delegation of crystalline beings from the Vega system, plant-based entities from worlds near the galactic rim, even a few rebel Zephyrians who had grown disgusted with their empire's brutality. Each new species brought unique abilities and perspectives that made their resistance stronger. The crystalline beings could process information at incredible speeds, turning tactical planning into an almost instantaneous process. The plant entities could grow biological technology that was completely undetectable by Zephyrian sensors. The rebel Zephyrians provided crucial intelligence about Imperial military planning, but it was the children who continued to amaze everyone. Marcus had become their chief technology officer, capable of integrating systems from dozens of different species into unified networks. Maya served as their primary communications coordinator, her telepathic abilities now strong enough to maintain contact across multiple star systems. Tommy led reconnaissance missions that consistently brought back intelligence that adult soldiers couldn't obtain. Lisa had developed into their early warning system, her sensitivity to danger now so acute that she could predict enemy movements hours in advance. And Elena, still just approaching her 3rd birthday, had somehow become their best diplomat, able to communicate with species that had never encountered humans before. Sarah often wondered what their father would think of what his children were becoming. David had died fighting to protect a single human colony, but his children were part of something that could liberate the entire galaxy. The test came when long-range sensors detected the approach of a Zephyrian battle fleet. 47 ships, including 3 dreadnoughts capable of reducing planets to asteroids. The enemy had decided to end their resistance permanently. But Sarah's force was no longer a small group hiding in caves. They now had 12 ships crewed by mixed-species teams, advanced weapons that combined the best of multiple technologies, and most importantly, they had allies throughout the enemy fleet itself. The battle for their adopted world would determine whether their vision of multi-species cooperation could survive its first real test against the full might of an empire that had conquered the galaxy through force and intimidation. As Sarah prepared her children and allies for the coming fight, she realized that they were no longer running from anything. They had found their home not in any single world, but in the bonds they'd formed with beings from across the stars. Tomorrow, they would either prove that cooperation was stronger than conquest or They would die trying, but they would face that test together, as a family that had grown far beyond the boundaries of any single species. The final battle began not in space, but in the minds of children who had learned to dream beyond the boundaries of their own species. Sarah stood on the bridge of their flagship, a modified Zephyrian cruiser that had been transformed by the combined technologies of a dozen worlds. Around her, humans worked alongside kitties, dancers, grumps, crystalline beings, and even former Zephyrian soldiers who had chosen freedom over empire. Enemy fleet dropping out of hyperspace, Marcus reported from the tactical station. At 14, he commanded respect from officers who had fought wars before he was born. 47 ships, just as our intelligence predicted. Maya, now 13 and serving as their communications officer, suddenly went rigid in her chair. "Mom, I'm getting something unusual. Transmissions from inside some of the enemy ships. It sounds like rebellion." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This was what they'd been working toward for months, but she hadn't dared hope it would happen so quickly. "Can you establish contact?" she asked. Maya's eyes closed in concentration, her enhanced telepathic abilities reaching across the vast distances of space to touch minds she'd never encountered before. When she opened them again, tears of joy were streaming down her face. 17 ships have mixed crews, she reported. Enslaved species who learned about us from our transmissions. They're ready to join us, but they need our help to take control of their vessels. Sarah turned to her tactical display, studying the approaching fleet with new understanding. What had appeared to be an overwhelming enemy force was actually a collection of potential allies trapped under Zephyrian control. "Signal all ships," she ordered. "We're not fighting a battle today. We're conducting a rescue operation." Tommy, now 10 years old and commanding a reconnaissance squadron that included pilots from 6 different species, spoke up from his station. "Mom, Lisa's getting one of her feelings. She says something big is about to change." 8-year-old Lisa nodded solemnly from her position at the early warning console. Her precognitive abilities had grown so strong that even the crystalline beings consulted her before making strategic decisions. "The scary feeling is going away," she announced. "Something good is coming instead." Elena, now 3 years old and serving as their cultural liaison, was playing with a group of young beings from various species in a corner of the bridge. Their games looked like simple child's play, but Sarah had learned that these sessions often produced insights that helped their adult strategists solve complex problems. "Auntie Scar says the star lizards are crying," Elena announced, using her own name for the Zephyrians. "They don't want to fight anymore." Through their mental link, Scar shared images that confirmed Elena's innocent observation. Zephyrian crews throughout the fleet were experiencing something their empire had never encountered: doubt about their mission. Seeing the successful cooperation between species had shaken their fundamental beliefs about galactic hierarchy. Sarah made her decision. Instead of preparing for battle, she ordered their ships to broadcast on all frequencies a simple message that Maya translated into dozens of languages simultaneously. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Free Alliance. We offer sanctuary to any being who chooses cooperation over conquest. Join us and help us build a galaxy where all species can thrive together." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Ships throughout the Zephyrian fleet began reporting technical malfunctions as their enslaved crews took control of critical systems. 3 vessels changed course entirely, heading directly for Sarah's fleet with their former captains locked in their own brigs. But the real shock came from the Zephyrian command ship itself. "Mom, I'm receiving a transmission from Admiral Vextar himself," Maya reported, her voice filled with amazement. He wants to talk." Admiral Vextar had been the architect of the Zephyrian conquest doctrine, responsible for enslaving dozens of worlds. That he would even consider negotiation was unprecedented. "Put him through," Sarah ordered. The reptilian face that appeared on their main screen was older and more tired than Sarah had expected. When Vextar spoke, his words carried a weariness that seemed to come from centuries of warfare. "Captain Chen, I have spent my entire life believing that order could only come through dominance," he said. "But your alliance has achieved what our empire could not. You have created stability through cooperation. I wish to understand how this is possible." Sarah looked around her bridge, seeing the future of the galaxy reflected in the diverse beings who had become her family. Marcus and Maya, human children who had learned to think like a dozen different species. Tommy and Lisa, who commanded respect from warriors twice their age. Elena, who treated every new being she met as a potential friend. "It's possible because we stopped seeing differences as threats," Sarah replied. "We started seeing them as opportunities to become something better than any of us could be alone." What followed was not the massive battle everyone had expected, but the largest mass defection in galactic history. Ship after ship declared independence from the Zephyrian Empire, their crews choosing to join an alliance that offered equality over servitude. Within hours, Sarah's fleet had grown from 12 ships to nearly 40. More importantly, they had gained allies from species throughout the galaxy, each bringing unique abilities and perspectives that made their alliance stronger. Admiral Vexitar was among those who formally requested to join, bringing with him detailed intelligence about remaining Imperial strongholds and a growing faction of Zephyrians who had grown tired of endless conquest. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the gardens of New Geneva, watching her children play with beings from 100 different worlds. The planet had been liberated and was now serving as the capital of the Free Alliance, a growing federation of species committed to cooperation over conquest. Marcus, now 15, was working with representatives from the Andromedan Collective to develop new technologies that would benefit all member species. Maya served as one of the Alliance's primary ambassadors, her telepathic abilities making her ideal for first contact situations. Tommy commanded the Alliance Scout Service, leading exploration missions to find new worlds that could join their federation. Lisa had become their chief strategic advisor, her ability to sense patterns helping them prevent conflicts before they began. And Elena, now 4 years old, was simply being a child in a galaxy where children of all species could grow up without fear. The Free Alliance controlled only a small portion of the galaxy, and there were still plenty of threats to face. But they had proven something that would echo across the stars for generations to come. They had shown that diversity was not weakness, that cooperation was stronger than conquest, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting battles, but from making enemies into friends. Sarah often thought about the colony ship Harmony destroyed in flames so long ago. The refugees who had died in that attack would never see the galaxy their sacrifice had helped create. But their children were building something worthy of their memory, a future where no one would have to flee burning ships, because there would always be safe harbors waiting among the stars. As evening fell over New Geneva, Sarah gathered her family close and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere up there, other ships were carrying other families toward new hopes and new homes. The nest might have been engulfed in flames, but from those ashes had risen something stronger, something that would endure long after the last tyrant was defeated and the last slave was freed. They had carried their cubs to safety, but more than that, they had taught the galaxy that safety was something all species could share, if only they were brave enough to trust each other and work together toward a common dream of freedom among the stars.